It was in the early autumn of 1903 that Dr. Edmund Fairweather found himself in possession of a most peculiar inheritance. His late uncle, Silas Fairweather, had been a collector of antiquities, though not, it must be said, a particularly discriminating one. The old gentleman had filled his modest house in Bury St. Edmunds with an assortment of curiosities that ranged from genuinely valuable medieval manuscripts to frankly dubious relics of no scholarly merit whatsoever. Edmund, who held a fellowship at Cambridge and specialized in ecclesiastical history of the 14th century, had accepted the task of cataloging and disposing of his uncle's collection with some reluctance. He was not a man given to sentiment, but neither was he entirely immune to the melancholy that attends the dissolution of a life's accumulated treasures. However questionable their worth, the house itself was a narrow, three-story affair in the old part of the town, squeezed between a stationer's shop and what had once been a coaching inn. Its rooms were dark and close, the windows small and mullioned, and everywhere there hung the particular smell of old paper, leather, and that indefinable mustiness that clings to places where the sun is seldom admitted. For 3 days, Edmund had worked methodically through the collection, making notes, setting aside items for the university library, marking others for auction. It was tedious work, but not unpleasant. He had taken lodgings at the Angel Hotel and walked to the house each morning, letting himself in with the heavy iron key the solicitor had provided. On the 4th day, while examining the contents of a chest in what had served as his uncle's study, Edmund discovered something that gave him pause. Wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath a pile of worthless pamphlets on agricultural improvement, he found a small wooden box, no more than 12 inches square and perhaps 3 inches deep. The wood was dark with age, possibly oak, and bore no decoration, save for a curious symbol burned into the lid, a circle containing what appeared to be an eye. Though the crude execution made it difficult to be certain, the box was locked, but the key hung from a ribbon attached to one of the brass hinges. Edmund turned it carefully, half expecting the mechanism to have rusted shut, but it opened with surprising ease. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single item, a photograph, or rather, what appeared to be a photographic plate mounted in a small wooden frame. Now, Edmund was familiar with early photographic processes. He had, after all, catalogued numerous collections, but this particular specimen struck him as odd from the first moment. The image showed what appeared to be a room, perhaps a chamber in some ecclesiastical building. Judging by the Gothic window visible on one side and the suggestion of vaulted stonework, the lighting was peculiar, as if the room were illuminated by some source just beyond the frame's edge, casting long shadows that seemed to pool in the corners. But it was the figure in the photograph that arrested Edmund's attention. Standing, or perhaps one should say positioned in the center of the frame, was what could only be described as a human form, though whether living or sculptural, Edmund could not immediately determine. The figure wore what appeared to be medieval religious vestments, and its posture suggested either profound devotion or terrible supplication. Most disturbing of all was the face, which seemed somehow blurred or indistinct, as if the subject had moved during the exposure, though the rest of the image was perfectly sharp. Edmund held the framed plate up to the window, angling it to catch the afternoon light. As he did so, he experienced a curious sensation, a fleeting impression that the shadows in the photographed room had shifted slightly, that the figure's arms had not been raised quite so high a moment before. He blinked and looked again. No, everything was exactly as it had been. A trick of the light, nothing more. Turning the frame over, Edmund discovered a small brass plate affixed to the back. The inscription, in neat copperplate hand, read, "The Penitent Chamber, St. Botolph's, Suffolk, May 1867. Do not display after dark." The final phrase was underlined twice. Edmund set the photograph on the desk and returned to examining the chest, but found his attention repeatedly drawn back to the framed plate. There was something about it, something beyond its obvious antiquity, or the oddness of the warning, that troubled him. The room depicted seemed familiar, though he could not place where he might have seen it. And that figure, he consulted his uncle's papers, searching for any mention of St. Botolph's or of the photograph itself, but found nothing. The name St. Botolph was common enough there were churches dedicated to that saint throughout East Anglia, but without further specification. It would be difficult to determine which particular establishment was depicted. As the light began to fail, Edmund gathered his notes and prepared to return to his hotel. He wrapped the photograph carefully in its oilcloth and placed it in his leather document case, intending to examine it more thoroughly in better light. The warning about not displaying it after dark seemed like the sort of melodramatic fancy that would have appealed to his uncle, who had been fond of Gothic novels and spiritualist pamphlets. Yet as Edmund locked the house door behind him and set off down the darkening street, he found himself walking rather more quickly than usual, and glancing back over his shoulder with an uncharacteristic frequency that he could not entirely explain. That the following morning brought one of those gray, close days that are peculiar to autumn in East Anglia. A fine drizzle hung in the air, not quite rain, but sufficient to render everything damp and unpleasant. Edmund took a later breakfast than was his custom, lingering over the hotel's excellent coffee and occupying himself with the morning newspapers. He had brought the photograph down to the dining room with him, intending to examine it again in the clear northern light that came through the tall windows. But somehow, in the bustle of breakfast service and the mundane chatter of the other guests, the thing seemed less remarkable than it had in his uncle's dim study. It was merely an old photograph, albeit an unusual one. The warning on the back was doubtless some private joke or reference, whose meaning had died with those who made it. Nevertheless, Edmund found himself curious about St. Botolph's. After breakfast, he walked to the town's principal library, a handsome Georgian building on Angel Hill, and requested such local histories and church registers as might shed light on ecclesiastical establishments in the county. The librarian, a thin, elderly gentleman with pince-nez spectacles and an air of perpetual distraction, proved unexpectedly helpful. There were, he informed Edmund, 3 churches dedicated to St. Botolph within 20 miles of Bury St. Edmunds, but only one located in the village of Thornfield, some 8 miles distant, that retained any medieval fabric of significance. Though I believe the place has been disused for some years, the librarian added, consulting a dog-eared volume. Yes, here we are. Services were discontinued in 1889 owing to structural concerns. The parish was consolidated with that of Lesser Thornfield. A pity. The church contains some rather fine 14th century work, I understand, though I confess I have never visited it myself. Is the building still standing? Edmund inquired. Oh yes, I believe so, though whether it remains accessible, I could not say. These abandoned churches often fall into a most deplorable state of neglect. The librarian shook his head sadly. The ecclesiastical commissioners are not what they were. Edmund spent the remainder of the morning in the library, making notes and copying what information he could find regarding Thornfield and its church. The parish was ancient, mentioned in Domesday, and the church appeared to have been rebuilt in the late 13th or early 14th century, on the site of an earlier Saxon foundation. There were references to a chantry chapel established in 1347, and a curious note regarding renovations undertaken in 1523, which had apparently revealed certain chambers previously sealed, the purpose of which remained obscure. It was this last detail that caught Edmund's attention. A sealed chamber in a medieval church might be many things: an anchorite's cell, a charnel house, a treasury, but the phrase "purpose obscure" suggested something unusual, enough to have troubled those who discovered it. By early afternoon, Edmund had determined to visit Thornfield. The village was not far, and the weather, though still gray, had improved sufficiently to make the journey practicable. He could hire a trap from the hotel stable and be there in an hour, leaving ample time for an inspection before the light failed. The proprietor of the Angel was happy to arrange the conveyance, though he raised his eyebrows slightly when Edmund mentioned his destination. Thornfield, sir? There's not much there, I'm afraid. A dozen cottages and a farmhouse or two. Most folk have moved away these past years. I'm interested in the old church, Edmund explained. Ah, the proprietor's expression became carefully neutral. Yes, the church. Well, it's still there, right enough, though I can't say when it was last opened. You might want to speak with Mr. Hewitt, the sexton at St. Mary's here in town. I believe he has charge of the keys. in a manner of speaking. Something in the man's tone suggested a reservation that Edmund could not quite interpret, but he thanked him and set off to find this Hewitt. The sexton proved to be a stout, ruddy-faced man of perhaps 60 years, who received Edmund's inquiry with evident reluctance. "Thornfield Church. I have the keys, or I did. Haven't been called to open the place these 5 years or more." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What would you be wanting there, if you don't mind my asking?" Edmund explained his scholarly interest, and mentioned the photograph he had found among his uncle's effects. Hewitt's expression shifted subtly, not alarm, precisely, but something close to it. "Your uncle wouldn't have been old Silas Fairweather, by any chance?" "He was Hewitt was silent for a moment. "Well then, yes, I suppose it makes sense he'd have something from there. He was uncommon interested in that church, was Mr. Fairweather. Went there several times. Back in the 80s, when I first had charge of the keys. Always asking about the crypt and the old chambers." He paused. "Last time he went, though, he came back. Well, different, you might say. Wouldn't speak of what he'd seen, but he never asked for the keys again." "Different in what way?" Hewitt seemed to consider how much to say. "Troubled," he said at last, "like a man who'd had a shock. Kept his shutters closed after that. Spent more and more time indoors. But perhaps I'm saying too much. Old Silas was always a bit peculiar, if you'll pardon my saying so." Edmund pressed for details about the church itself. Hewitt provided them readily enough. The building was intact, though in poor repair. The roof sound, but the interior damp and growing derelict. There was a crypt, largely empty now, and what had been called the penitent's chamber. A small room built into the thickness of the wall near the chancel. "The penitent's chamber," Edmund repeated. "That was mentioned in the inscription on the photograph." "Aye, it would be." Hewitt's face had taken on a closed expression. "If you must go, sir, I'd advise you to complete your business in good daylight. The place has a reputation locally. Foolishness, most like, but country folk have their notions." "What sort of reputation?" Hewitt shook his head. "Just old stories, sir. Pay them no mind. But all the same, good daylight, and don't linger." He fetched the keys to large iron specimens on a ring and passed them to Edmund, with what seemed like relief. "Return them when you're done, sir. And if you find anything in there that oughtn't to be disturbed, well, best to leave it be." The road to Thornfield wound through country that was neither particularly beautiful nor notably bleak, but possessed that quality of subtle melancholy that characterizes much of rural Suffolk. Fields gave way to copses of oak and ash, and small farmsteads huddled behind windbreaks of poplar. The drizzle had ceased, but the sky remained low and gray, pressing down like a lid upon the landscape. Edmund reached Thornfield shortly after 3 o'clock. The village was, as the hotel proprietor had suggested, a dispiriting place, a handful of cottages in various states of repair, a green overgrown with nettles, and an inn that appeared to have been closed for some years. He saw no one about, though smoke rose from 1 or 2 chimneys. The church stood on a slight rise at the edge of the village, surrounded by its graveyard and separated from the road by a low wall of flint and brick. It was a typical Suffolk church of the decorated period, with a square tower of knapped flint, a tiled roof, and windows of the characteristic flowing tracery of the early 14th century. Ivy had established itself firmly along the south wall, and several of the windows showed gaps where the glazing had failed. Edmund secured his horse to a post beside the light gate and approached on foot. The churchyard was overgrown, the gravestones leaning at angles and half obscured by grass and bramble. No one had tended this place in years, perhaps decades. The path to the south porch was barely discernible. The key turned with difficulty in the rusted lock, but at length Edmund heard the bolt withdraw. He put his shoulder to the door, and it opened with a groan of protesting hinges, releasing a gust of cold, stale air that smelled of damp stone and decay. The interior was surprisingly light, despite the overcast sky. The nave was simple and unadorned, the pews pushed against the walls and covered with dust. Bird droppings spattered the floor beneath the clerestory windows, and here and there sections of plaster had fallen from the walls, revealing the rubble and mortar beneath. Yet the basic structure seemed sound enough. and there was an austere beauty to the bare stone and empty space. Edmund walked slowly up the nave, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The chancel was separated from the nave by a simple rood screen, dark with age, its tracery work still intact. Beyond it, the altar had been removed, leaving only the stone mensa and the piscina in the south wall. It was on the north side of the chancel that Edmund found what he was seeking. Set into the thickness of the wall was a low doorway, barely 5 feet high, with a pointed arch and a door of blackened oak bound with iron straps. There was no lock, only a heavy bolt on the outside. Edmund drew the bolt and pulled the door open. It moved more easily than he had expected, as if the hinges had been kept oiled despite the church's general neglect. Beyond lay a short passage, perhaps 6 feet long, which opened into a small chamber. He struck a match and held it up. The flame illuminated a space perhaps 10 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling and a single narrow window, now heavily barred on the outside, set high in the outer wall. The chamber was completely empty save for a peculiar feature on the floor, a shallow depression, roughly circular and perhaps 3 feet in diameter, worn smooth as if by long use or the passage of many feet. But it was not the depression that held Edmund's attention. It was the absolute certainty, immediate and undeniable, that this was the room depicted in the photograph. The angle of the window, the curve of the vaulting, the very quality of the stone all matched exactly. He pulled the framed plate from his case and held it up, comparing. Yes, there could be no doubt. The photograph had been taken from almost exactly where he now stood. He lit another match and examined the chamber more closely. The walls were bare stone, showing no trace of plaster or decoration. The depression in the floor was puzzling. It was too shallow to be a grave or burial place, yet the wear suggested deliberate use. Around its edge, he thought he could detect faint markings, perhaps carved into the stone, but they were too worn to make out clearly. As he bent to examine these markings more closely, Edmund became aware of a sensation that he found difficult to articulate even to himself. It was not precisely that he felt watched, nor that he sensed another presence in the chamber. Rather, it was as if the space itself had become somehow attentive, as if the room were aware of him in the way that an animal, frozen in stillness, is aware of an intruder. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it with a small exclamation. In the moment of darkness before he struck another, he had the distinct impression that something had moved, not in the chamber itself, but in the photograph he held in his other hand. The fresh match flared up. Edmund held the framed plate steady and examined it carefully. The figure was exactly as it had been, arm raised, posture suggesting supplication or terror. Yet he could not shake the conviction that, for just an instant in the darkness, it had been different. He told himself not to be foolish. The mind played tricks in such circumstances: dim light, unfamiliar surroundings, the power of suggestion. Yet the feeling of wrongness persisted, growing stronger rather than diminishing. Edmund became aware that his breath was misting in the air. Though the day was not particularly cold, the temperature in the chamber seemed to have dropped markedly in the few minutes he had been there. And there was a smell now, barely perceptible beneath the general mustiness, something sweet and cloying, like flowers that have stood too long in water. He made a few quick notes in his pocketbook, sketching the layout of the chamber and marking the position of the depression. As he did so, he became conscious of a sound so faint that he could not at first be certain he heard it at all. It seemed to come from the passage that led back to the chancel, a soft susurration like fabric dragging across stone. Edmund turned quickly, holding up his guttering match. The passage was empty. Nothing moved in the shadows beyond. Yet the sound continued, and now it seemed to come from behind him, from the chamber itself, or perhaps from the narrow window high in the wall. It rose and fell with an almost rhythmic quality, like labored breathing or the whisper of a voice too distant to understand. The match went out. In the darkness, the sound grew louder, and Edmund felt with sudden certainty that he was no longer alone in the chamber. There was a presence, no, not a presence, but an awareness, something that pressed upon him from all sides, cold and terrible and infinitely patient. He fumbled in his pocket for another match, his hands shaking now, though whether from cold or from something deeper he could not say. The box slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. the matches scattering with a sound like rattling bones. Edmund dropped to his knees, groping in the darkness. His hand encountered the smooth stone of the depression, and the touch sent a shock through him, not pain, but a sensation of such profound wrongness that he jerked back as if burned. Light flooded the chamber. Edmund looked up, wildly at first, then with immense relief. A beam of late sunlight had broken through the overcast, and was shining directly through the high window, illuminating the chamber with pale amber light. In that light, he could see that he was quite alone. The chamber was exactly as it had been, bare, empty, silent. The scattered matches lay on the floor beside the depression, and his pocketbook rested where he had dropped it. Edmund gathered his belongings with hands that were not quite steady. The moment of panic seemed absurd now, in the prosaic light of day. He had allowed his imagination to run away with him, nothing more. Country churches were full of odd sounds, drafts, and settling timbers, and the movements of birds in the roof space. Yet as he backed out of the chamber and drew the door closed behind him, he was grateful for the solidity of the oak and the weight of the bolt as he shot it home, and he found that he had no desire whatsoever to linger in that place, or to wait for the sun to set before beginning his journey back to Bury St. Edmunds. He walked quickly down the nave, conscious now of every shadow, every dark corner, every space where the failing light did not quite reach. It was only when he emerged into the open air and pulled the church door shut behind him that his heartbeat began to slow. As he turned toward the light gate where his horse waited, Edmund glanced back at the church. The sunbeam that had illuminated the penitent's chamber had faded, and the building stood gray and silent against the darkening sky. But in one of the windows, the narrow window of the chamber itself, he thought he saw, for just an instant, the suggestion of movement. A pale shape pressed against the bars, as if something inside were looking out. Edmund did not wait to see if the impression resolved itself into certainty. He untied his horse, climbed into the trap, and urged the animal into a trot that he maintained all the way back to Bury St. Edmunds. Arriving just as the lamps were being lit along Angel Hill, Edmund spent a troubled night at the Angel Hotel. His rational mind insisted that he had experienced nothing more than the understandable nervousness of a man alone in an abandoned building, combined with the power of suggestion provided by his uncle's melodramatic warning. Yet sleep came only in fitful snatches, and twice he woke with the conviction that someone had been standing beside his bed, watching him in the darkness. On each occasion, the striking of a match revealed nothing but the familiar furniture of the hotel room, shadows dancing in the corners in the wavering flame, and the comforting sounds of the street below. Nevertheless, Edmund took the precaution of moving the photograph from his bedside table to his traveling case, which he locked and placed in the wardrobe. Foolish, perhaps, but he found he rested easier afterward. Morning brought renewed determination to get to the bottom of the matter. Edmund was not a man to be frightened away from scholarly inquiry by what amounted to an attack of nerves in a dark room. There must be some history to the penitent's chamber, some record of its purpose and the events that had led to its sealing. Such information would not only satisfy his curiosity, but would provide valuable context for his uncle's collection. After breakfast, he returned to the library and requested any additional materials relating to Thornfield Church. The elderly librarian produced several volumes, including a locally published history of Suffolk churches by one Reverend Augustus Pell, dated 1881. Pell's entry for Thornfield was disappointingly brief, occupying less than a page. The church was described in the usual terms, its architectural features catalogued, its monuments noted, its date of construction estimated. But there was one paragraph that arrested Edmund's attention. Of particular interest as a chamber, built into the north wall of the chancel, accessed by a low doorway and formerly known as the penitent's chamber. Though its original purpose remains a matter of some debate, local tradition holds that it was used for the confinement of those guilty of grave sins, who would be sealed within to contemplate their transgressions. The practice, if it ever existed, would have been highly irregular and ceased by the time of the Reformation. The chamber contains several curious features, which this writer was unfortunately unable to examine in detail, as the incumbent declined to provide access on the occasion of my visit. It may be noted that the villagers speak of the chamber with marked reluctance, and several elderly parishioners expressed the opinion that it were better left unopened. Edmund read the passage twice, then made careful notes. A chamber for the confinement of penitents, if that were true. It suggested something darker than the usual anchorite's cell or place of voluntary retreat. The phrase sealed within was particularly troubling. Had people been literally walled up in that small room? And if so, for what purpose? He consulted other volumes, searching for references to similar practices. The medieval church had certainly employed harsh measures to enforce discipline and extract penance, but the actual physical imprisonment of sinners was rare outside of monastic contexts. And even there, it was typically temporary. It was in a collection of ecclesiastical court records, dating from the reign of Edward III, that Edmund found his next clue. Among the records of the bishop's visitation to Suffolk parishes in 1348, the year of the Great Pestilence, was a brief entry regarding Thornfield. Item: complaint received that Thomas Bird, priest of Thornfield, hath caused a chamber to be made in the which he doth confine certain persons accused of witchcraft, and of congress with evil spirits, keeping them close shut until they be brought to confession. The said Bird to be examined touching these matters, and enjoined to cease such practices, which lack all authority of canon law. There was no record of what action, if any, had been taken in response to this complaint. The visitation had occurred in the midst of the Black Death, when larger concerns had doubtless occupied the bishop's attention. Bird's name did not appear in any subsequent documents Edmund could find, but this raised troubling questions. If Bird had been using the chamber to extract confessions, and given the date, one might imagine the kinds of accusations and suspicions that would have flourished during the plague years. Then what methods had he employed, and what had become of those imprisoned there? Edmund made his way to the county archives, where he spent the afternoon working through parish records and manorial documents. The death records for Thornfield Parish in 1348 to 1349 showed the expected spike in mortality, though the numbers were not as catastrophic as in some parishes. Several names were marked with marginal notes in Latin, which Edmund laboriously translated. Agnes Pratt, spinster, died in penitence, May Day 1348. John Carter, laborer, died unshriven, having been cast out, July 1348. Ellen Bird, widow, died in the keeping of her son, November 1348. This last entry was followed by a notation that caught Edmund's eye, said to have been poisoned by the art of malefactors, but proof lacking. Ellen Bird, presumably the mother of Thomas Bird, the priest, and she had died in the keeping of her son. Had she been one of those confined in the penitence chamber? The timing was suggestive. As the archives closed for the evening, Edmund gathered his notes and made his way back to the hotel in a thoughtful mood. A picture was beginning to emerge: a priest, perhaps unbalanced by the horrors of the plague, using his authority to imprison those he suspected of witchcraft or worse, his own mother among them, dying in his keeping under mysterious circumstances. And all of this centered on that small, cold chamber where Edmund had felt such overwhelming wrongness just the day before. Yet there was still the matter of the photograph. It had been taken in 1867, more than 500 years after these events. What had his uncle been doing there? What had he found, or what had found him, that had changed him so markedly? Edmund dined alone in the hotel restaurant, barely tasting his food. His mind was too occupied with the pieces of the puzzle, trying to fit them together into a coherent whole. When he retired to his room, he took the photograph from his traveling case and examined it again in the light of the reading lamp. The figure in the image seemed, if anything, more distinct than before. The vestments were clearly medieval in style, heavy and ornate. The posture was one of extreme supplication or terror, arms raised, head thrown back, mouth open as if in a cry or scream. And the face, though still oddly blurred, seemed to bear an expression of such anguish that Edmund found himself looking away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion captured there. He turned the frame over and read again the inscription on the back: The Penitent Chamber, St. Botolph's, Suffolk, May 1867. Do not display after dark. May the same month in which Agnes Pratt had died. 5 centuries earlier. Coincidence, surely, but Edmund found the parallel unsettling. It was as he was replacing the photograph in its oilcloth wrapping that he noticed something he had missed before. The velvet lining the box in which it had been stored was torn slightly at one corner, and beneath it was a slip of paper, yellowed with age. Edmund extracted the paper carefully. It was covered with writing in his uncle's hand, the cramped, spidery script he had come to know well over the past few days. The note was dated August 1887, and it read, "I have determined to return the plate to its resting place. What I have seen these past weeks has convinced me that some objects are not meant to be preserved, that some images capture more than mere light and shadow. The figure moves. I am certain of it now. Each time I examine the plate, it is in a different position, never greatly so, but enough to be undeniable. Last night, I woke to find it displayed on my desk, though I had locked it away. The face was turned toward my bed, and in the darkness I could swear I heard breathing. Tomorrow I will return to Thornfield. I will place the plate in the chamber where the photograph was taken. Perhaps there it will be, still. Perhaps the thing captured in the image wishes only to return to its proper place. I hope so. God help me, I hope so." The note ended abruptly, without signature, but it was followed by a single line in a different ink, added later, "I could not do it. I was afraid to enter the chamber again." Edmund set the paper down with hands that had begun to tremble. He looked at the photograph, still half wrapped on the desk before him, and for a long moment he could not bring himself to touch it. The figure in the image had not moved. He was certain of that. It was exactly as it had been every time he had examined it. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, "Are you certain? Are you truly certain?" Outside, the church bells of St. Mary's struck 10. Edmund wrapped the photograph completely in its oilcloth, placed it back in the box, and locked the box in his traveling case. Then he locked the case in the wardrobe, turned off the lamp, and climbed into bed. But he did not sleep for a very long time, and when he finally did, his dreams were troubled by images of a small stone chamber, and a figure in medieval vestments that turned, slowly, to face him in the darkness. The next day dawned gray and cold, with a wind from the east that promised rain before evening. Edmund breakfasted early and set out on foot for St. Mary's Church, where he hoped to find the sexton Hewitt and perhaps extract more information about Thornfield and his uncle's visits there. He found the sexton in the churchyard, raking leaves from between the gravestones. Hewitt looked up at Edmund's approach and nodded a greeting, though his expression suggested he was not entirely pleased to see the younger man. "You went to Thornfield then?" he said. "It was not a question. I did," Edmund replied, "and I found the chamber, but I confess myself puzzled as to its history. I wonder if you might tell me what you know of it and of my uncle's interest in the place." Hewitt leaned on his rake and regarded Edmund with a measuring look. "Might be better to let sleeping dogs lie, sir. Your uncle would have said the same, toward the end. Nevertheless, I should like to know." The sexton sighed. "Well, you're a grown man and entitled to make your own mistakes. Come inside, then. What I have to tell you isn't for the open air." They entered the church through the north door and sat in a pew near the font. The interior was dim despite the windows, the gray light filtering through stained glass and creating pools of colored shadow. On the stone floor, Hewitt was silent for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then began to speak. "Your uncle first came asking about Thornfield maybe 20 years back. Said he was interested in old churches and their customs. I took him there and opened the place up. It was still in use then, just barely. Services once a month or so. He spent an hour or more inside, taking notes and measurements, all very scholarly-like. But it was the penitent's chamber that held his attention. He asked me all manner of questions about it. What was it for? When was it last used? Had anyone ever reported anything unusual about it? I told him what little I knew, that it was supposed to be a place where sinners would be locked up to repent, back in the old days. And I told him that my grandfather, who'd been sexton before me, had said the chamber was never to be opened at night, and never on certain dates." "What dates?" Edmund asked. "May Day and All Hallows Eve." Grandfather never explained why, and I never thought to ask. Just country superstition, I supposed. My uncle visited more than once, I understand. Hewitt nodded. 3 or 4 times, maybe. Each time he'd spend longer in that chamber. The last time must have been '87 or thereabouts. He had some sort of photographic apparatus with him. Said he wanted to make a record of the place. I helped him carry the equipment in, but I didn't stay. Something about that chamber. He shook his head. I've been in many an old church, sir, and I'm not a fanciful man, but that place has a feeling to it. Cold it is, even on the hottest summer day, and there's a sense of waiting, as if something's biding its time there. Did my uncle tell you what he photographed? No, sir, but when he came out, he looked terrible, white as chalk and shaking. Wouldn't speak of it, just packed up his things and left in a hurry. I asked him if he was all right, and he said, I remember it clear, he said. I've seen what should not be seen, and now it has seen me. A chill ran down Edmund's spine. What did he mean? I couldn't say, sir, but I can tell you this. He came back one more time, maybe 2 weeks later, carrying that same equipment. Said he needed to return something, but he was only inside for a few minutes before he came running out. Literally running, sir, an old gentleman of 70-odd years. He thrust the keys at me and said he'd never set foot in Thornfield again. And as far as I know, he never did. Edmund was silent, absorbing this. Did he say what frightened him? He did not. But I'll tell you what I saw, and you can make of it what you will. When I went to lock up the church that evening, this was after your uncle had left in such a state, I noticed something odd about the chamber door. It was standing open, just a crack. Now, I knew I'd bolted it shut after your uncle's first visit, and I was certain it had been closed when he left. But there it was open. I went to close it proper, and as I put my hand on the door, I heard something from inside the chamber. A sound like someone drawing breath, long and slow and ragged, as if they'd been holding it for a very long time. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed that door shut and shot the bolt, and I've made certain it stayed bolted ever since. Edmund felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. And you've heard nothing since? Nothing I care to speak of, Hewitt said shortly. But I'll tell you this, sir. There's a reason that church was abandoned. Oh, they said it was structural problems, damp in the walls and such. But the truth is, the last vicar who served there, Reverend Caldwell, this would be back in '85, he refused to conduct services anymore. Said he couldn't concentrate on the liturgy. That he felt watched every moment he was in that building. Said he'd seen things moving in the shadows of the chancel, and heard sounds coming from behind that bolted door. What sort of sounds? Hewitt looked uncomfortable. Prayers, sir. Someone praying in Latin over and over. The same phrases repeated endlessly, as if whoever was saying them had been doing so for a very long time and had forgotten how to stop. Edmund remembered the death record he had found. Thomas Bird, priest of Thornfield. Had the man imprisoned others in that chamber only to find himself somehow trapped there in turn? Or was something else at work? Something that had been captured in his uncle's photograph and was now, impossibly, trying to manifest beyond it. There's one more thing, Hewitt said, lowering his voice, though they were quite alone in the church. After your uncle's last visit, I did a bit of asking around among the old folks in Thornfield. Most wouldn't speak of the church at all. But one old woman, she's dead now. This would be nearly 20 years past. She told me a story her grandmother had told her. She said that back in the plague times, there was a priest at Thornfield who went mad with fear and suspicion. He became convinced that the pestilence was a punishment sent by God for the sins of his parishioners, and that the only way to save the village was to root out the sinners and make them confess. He had a chamber built, or maybe it was already there. She wasn't clear, and he'd lock people in it, sometimes for days. He'd force them to pray without ceasing, standing in that worn spot on the floor, until they either confessed to whatever sin he accused them of or collapsed from exhaustion. Several people died in that chamber, the old woman said. Died praying, and the priest's own mother was one of them. She'd opposed what he was doing, you see, tried to protect her neighbors, so he accused her of witchcraft and had her locked in. She was in there for 3 days before she died, praying and begging to be let out. And when they finally opened the chamber, they found her body standing upright in that depression in the floor, arms raised, as if she'd been frozen in the act of prayer. Edmund felt sick. The figure in the photograph, the posture of desperate supplication, suddenly made horrible sense. What happened to the priest? He managed to ask. The villagers rose up against him, Hewitt said. This was at the height of the plague, remember, when normal law and order had broken down. They dragged him to the church and locked him in that same chamber, left him there to pray as he'd made others pray. No one knows how long he survived, some say days, some say weeks. But when they finally opened the door, they found him mad, if he was still alive at all. The records aren't clear. Some say he died there, some say he lived, but was never right in his head again. But the old woman told me this. Her grandmother swore that you could still hear him in that chamber, even now, praying the same prayers he'd forced on his victims over and over, unable to stop even in death. And she said that sometimes, when the chamber was opened, you could see them, the ghosts of those who'd died there, still standing in that worn place, in the floor, arms raised, crying out for mercy that never came. The two men sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the churchyard. Edmund found himself thinking of that cold stone chamber, and the depression in the floor worn smooth by countless hours of enforced penance. "Why did you not tell me this before?" Edmund asked at last. "Would you have believed me?" Hewitt replied, "And besides, sir, some things are better left unknown. Your uncle learned that, in the end. Whatever he captured in that photograph, whatever he brought back from Thornfield, it troubled him for the rest of his days." Edmund thought of the photograph, locked away in his hotel room. He thought of his uncle's note, "The figure moves," and he thought of what Hewitt had just told him, that the ghosts of Bird's victims were still there, trapped in an endless cycle of forced prayer and supplication. "I must ask you something," Edmund said slowly. "The photograph my uncle made, did you ever see it?" Hewitt shook his head firmly. "No, sir, and I'll thank you not to show it to me. Whatever's in that picture, it's best left in darkness. But suppose," Edmund hesitated, then pressed on, "suppose the photograph were returned to the chamber. Would that end it? Would the thing captured in it be able to rest?" Hewitt gave him a long, appraising look. "That's what your uncle thought, isn't it? That's why he tried to go back. But he couldn't do it. Whatever he saw, whatever he felt in that chamber, it was too much for him." "I'm younger than he was," Edmund said, with more confidence than he felt, and forewarned. "Are you thinking of going back there?" Hewitt's voice was sharp with concern. "Sir, I'd advise strongly against it. Whatever's in that photograph, whatever's in that chamber, it's been quiet these past years. Best to let it stay that way." But Edmund had already made up his mind. The scholar in him could not let the matter rest, not when he had the means to potentially end whatever torment his uncle had uncovered. And there was something else, something he was reluctant to admit even to himself. The photograph had begun to disturb him. He found himself thinking about it at odd moments, wondering if it had changed, if the figure had moved. Better to be rid of it, to return it to the place from which it had come. "I'll need the keys again," he said. "Tomorrow, in good daylight. And I promise you, I'll be careful." Hewitt sighed heavily. "You'll do as you think best, sir. But mark my words, some doors are closed for good reason. Once you open them, there's no telling what may come through." That night, Edmund had cause to remember Hewitt's words. He had dined early and retired to his room, intending to make a full transcript of his notes and to prepare himself mentally for the following day's expedition to Thornfield. The photograph remained locked in his traveling case, which in turn was secured in the wardrobe. At 10:30, as Edmund was preparing for bed, he heard a sound from the wardrobe, a soft click, as of a lock being turned from the inside. He froze, listening. The sound came again, unmistakable this time. The wardrobe door swung slowly open, though Edmund was certain he had locked it. In the lamplight, he could see his traveling case sitting on the shelf where he had placed it. As he watched, the clasps of the case sprang open with a sharp snap. Edmund's rational mind insisted that there must be some mechanical explanation of faulty lock, the case being jostled by the opening door. But his instincts told him otherwise. He approached the wardrobe slowly, every sense alert. The case lid rose as if pushed from within. Inside, wrapped in its oilcloth, was the photograph. But the oilcloth had been partially unwrapped, and in the lamplight Edmund could see the framed plate clearly. The figure had moved. There was no possibility of doubt, no room for tricks of light or memory. The arms, which had been raised in supplication, were now lowered slightly. The head, which had been thrown back, was now inclined forward, and the face, God help him, the face was clearer than before. He could see features now, a woman's face, middle-aged, contorted with anguish and terror. The mouth was open wide, as if in a scream. Edmund's hand trembled as he reached for the photograph. The moment his fingers touched the frame, he felt it a sensation like an electric shock, but cold rather than hot. It ran up his arm and seemed to penetrate to his very core, bringing with it a flood of impressions that were not quite images, not quite sounds, but something between the two. He saw the chamber at Thornfield, but not as he had seen it. He saw it in darkness, lit only by a single candle. He saw a woman standing in the depression in the floor, her arms raised, her face contorted with exhaustion and fear. He heard her voice, hoarse from prayer, reciting Latin phrases over and over, Miserere mei Deus, have mercy on me, O God. And he saw another figure standing in the doorway, a man in priest's vestments, his face hidden in shadow, watching with terrible patience as the woman's strength failed, as her voice grew weaker, as her prayers became mere gasps and whimpers. The vision of that was what it was lasted only seconds. But when Edmund came back to himself, he found that he was standing with the photograph, clutched in both hands, his face wet with tears he did not remember shedding. He set the frame down on the desk with hands that shook badly. The figure in the image had not changed further, but Edmund knew with absolute certainty that what he held was no mere photograph. Somehow, impossibly, his uncle had captured something in that image, a moment of suffering so intense that it had imprinted itself upon the very fabric of reality, persisting across centuries. And now that image was trying to complete itself, to reach some resolution that it had been denied in life. Edmund wrapped the photograph carefully in its oilcloth and replaced it in the case, which he locked with fingers that fumbled at the clasps. But he did not return the case to the wardrobe. Instead, he placed it in the corner of the room farthest from his bed, and he moved his chair so that it blocked direct line of sight between the case and where he would sleep. He turned down the lamp, but did not extinguish it completely, leaving a small flame burning. The shadows it cast seemed to move and shift in ways that had nothing to do with the flickering wick. Edmund lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unwilling to close his eyes. Every creak of the old building, every sound from the street below, made him start, and always his attention was drawn back to that corner where the photograph lay hidden, as if it exerted some terrible gravitational pull upon his awareness. It was perhaps midnight when he heard it, so faint that at first he thought it was his imagination. A sound like distant praying, the words in Latin, spoken in a woman's voice hoarse with exhaustion, Miserere mei Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuam. The voice seemed to come from the direction of the photograph, but also from much farther away, from across town, perhaps, or across centuries. It rose and fell in a rhythmic cadence that spoke of endless repetition, of prayers recited beyond the point of meaning, beyond hope, beyond everything except the mechanical necessity of continuing, because to stop would mean death. Edmund sat up in bed, his heart hammering. The voice continued, never quite loud enough to make out individual words clearly, but always there, just at the edge of hearing, and beneath it, or perhaps above it, he heard another sound, breathing, slow and labored, as if someone were standing in the room with him, watching him in the darkness. He struck a match with shaking hands and lit the lamp fully. The room sprang into brightness, empty and normal. The praying stopped abruptly, as if cut off by a knife. But Edmund could swear he felt something withdraw, not leave the room entirely, but retreat into the shadows at the edges of the lamplight, waiting. He did not sleep again that night. He sat in the chair, the lamp burning, and watched the case in the corner until gray dawn began to show through the curtains. Only when full daylight flooded the room did he finally allow himself to relax slightly, though the tension did not entirely leave his shoulders. As the church bells struck 7, Edmund made his decision. He would go to Thornfield today, not tomorrow, but today. He would take the photograph back to the chamber and leave it there, as his uncle had intended to do. Whatever entity or remnant of suffering was bound to that image, it belonged in that place, and there it would stay. He dressed quickly and went down to breakfast. Though he had little appetite, the other guests seemed abnormally cheerful to him, their conversation about the weather and local gossip absurdly prosaic. Given what he had experienced during the night, he forced himself to eat, knowing he would need his strength, and then went to arrange for a trap to take him to Thornfield. The hotel proprietor expressed surprise at his urgency, but agreed to have the conveyance ready within the hour. Edmund returned to his room and gathered his things: the photograph in its case, a lantern, matches, and his notebook. He also took the precaution of writing a brief letter to a colleague at Cambridge, explaining where he was going and why, and leaving it with the hotel desk to be posted if he had not returned by nightfall. Melodramatic, perhaps, but after the previous night, Edmund was taking no chances. The morning was cold and gray, with a promise of rain in the heavy clouds that pressed low over the Suffolk landscape. As the trap rattled along the road to Thornfield, Edmund found himself rehearsing what he would do. Enter the church, go directly to the chamber, place the photograph in the depression in the floor, the place where its subject had stood, and prayed and died, and leave immediately. Simple, quick, safe. But even as he thought this, he knew it would not be that simple. Nothing about this had been simple, and he had the growing conviction that whatever haunted that chamber would not simply accept the photograph's return without exacting some kind of price. He reached Thornfield shortly after 10 o'clock. The village seemed even more deserted than before. The shutters of the cottages closed despite the hour. No smoke rose from the chimneys. Edmund had the uneasy feeling that the inhabitants knew he was coming and had made themselves scarce. The church stood gray and silent on its rise, the graveyard wild around it. As Edmund approached with the traveling case under his arm, he thought he saw movement in one of the windows, the narrow window of the penitent's chamber. But when he looked directly at it, there was nothing but shadow and old glass. He unlocked the south door and stepped inside. The interior seemed darker than he remembered, though the hour was earlier. The gray light filtering through the windows had a peculiar quality, as if it were somehow thickened or diminished by the atmosphere within the church. Edmund walked up the nave, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The rude screen loomed before him, its carved tracery seeming to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. Beyond it, the chancel stretched away into shadow. The door to the penitent's chamber stood before him, its bolt drawn. Edmund's hand froze halfway to the iron ring. He had bolted it shut when he left 2 days ago. He was certain of it. Someone or something had been here since, had opened the door and left it thus, as if in invitation, or in challenge. Edmund set down the traveling case and extracted the photograph, leaving it wrapped in its oilcloth. He lit the lantern, adjusted the flame, and took a deep breath. Then he pulled open the door and stepped into the passage beyond. The temperature dropped the moment Edmund crossed the threshold. His breath misted in the lantern light, and the cold seemed to penetrate through his coat and waistcoat to the skin beneath. It was the cold of deep earth, of places that have not known warmth in centuries. The passage was exactly as he remembered: bare stone, low ceiling, opening into the small chamber beyond. But there was a difference in the quality of the darkness there. It seemed somehow thicker, more present, as if it were not merely the absence of light, but a substance in itself. Edmund raised the lantern and stepped into the chamber. For a moment, everything was as it had been. The bare walls, the vaulted ceiling, the narrow window high up, the depression in the floor, worn smooth by countless hours of enforced penance. Then he became aware that he was not alone. There was no visible presence, no figure standing in the shadows. But Edmund felt it with absolute certainty, the awareness of another consciousness in the space, something that had been waiting for him, that had perhaps drawn him here through means he could not comprehend. The air itself seemed to press upon him, heavy and expectant, and in that pressure, Edmund sensed something that chilled him more than the physical cold: hunger. Whatever was in this chamber with him, it was hungry, starving. In fact, for something it had been denied for a very long time. He moved forward slowly, the wrapped photograph clutched in one hand, the lantern in the other. His plan had been to simply place the photograph in the depression and leave. But now he found himself hesitating. The worn place in the floor seemed somehow more pronounced than before, as if it had deepened. And as he looked at it, Edmund had the unsettling impression that it was not merely a depression worn by standing feet, but rather the mouth of something, a throat, perhaps, leading down into unimaginable depths. The thought was irrational, absurd, yet he could not shake it. He bent to place the photograph on the floor beside the depression, intending to unwrap it there. But the moment he lowered his hand, he felt resistance, a force that seemed to push against his arm, preventing him from completing the action. It was not violent, but firm, implacable. Whatever haunted this place did not want the photograph simply placed on the floor. It wanted him to stand in the depression, to hold the photograph while standing in that same spot where its subject had stood, and prayed and died. Edmund straightened up, his heart racing. No, absolutely not. That was madness. He would leave the photograph here, wrapped or unwrapped, and let whatever entity inhabited this space do with it as it wished. But even as he thought this, his feet were moving, not by his own volition, or at least, not entirely. It was as if something had insinuated itself into the gap between thought and action, gently guiding his movements, one step, then another, until he stood at the very edge of the depression. The lantern light wavered, and Edmund realized his hand was shaking. He tried to step back, but found he could not. His feet seemed rooted to the stone, as immovable as if they had become part of the floor itself. The temperature dropped further. Edmund could see his breath now in great plumes of vapor. His ears began to ring with a high, thin sound, like the whine of a dying bell. And beneath that sound, growing louder, came the praying, that same voice he had heard in his hotel room. But clearer now, more distinct. Miserere me Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuam, a woman's voice, hoarse and broken, reciting the Miserere psalm. The voice was coming from all around him, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. And with each word, Edmund felt the presence in the chamber grow stronger, more defined. He looked down at the photograph he held. Even through the oilcloth, he could feel it growing warmer, as if some energy were building within it. The wrapping began to smolder at the edges. Edmund tore away the oilcloth with hands that no longer seemed entirely under his control. The photograph was revealed, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The figure in the image was moving, not a trick of light or imagination, but actual, undeniable movement. The arms were rising, the head tilting back, the mouth opening wider, and the face God in heaven. The face was clearer than it had ever been. He could see every line of suffering, every trace of exhaustion and terror. He could see tears on the cheeks, and the particular quality of desperation in the eyes. And he recognized her, not by name. He had never known her name in life, but he recognized her as the woman from his vision, the one who had been locked in this chamber by the mad priest Thomas Bird, Ellen Bird, the priest's own mother, who had died praying for mercy that never came. The voice grew louder, no longer just reciting the psalm, but crying out, pleading, let me rest, let me cease. I have prayed enough. 500 years, I have prayed enough. The depression in the floor beneath Edmund's feet began to glow with a faint, cold light. He looked down and saw that it was not stone at all, but something else, something that moved and shifted like water or smoke or the fabric of a dream. And in that shifting surface, he saw images, a woman standing where he now stood, arms raised in supplication, praying while a figure in priest's vestments watched from the doorway. Days passing, the woman growing weaker, her voice failing, her prayers becoming mere whispers. The priest never leaving, never showing mercy, maintaining his terrible vigil as his mother died on her feet. And then horror upon horror, the woman's death, but not her release. Her spirit, bound by the priest's will and the power of endless enforced prayer, unable to depart, trapped in this chamber, standing in this same spot, condemned to continue the prayers even after death had claimed her body. Years passing, decades, centuries, the priest himself dying. Edmund saw that too, saw him locked in this same chamber by the villagers, saw him praying beside his mother's ghost, saw his own spirit join hers in that endless cycle of supplication, saw both of them standing in the worn place, generation after generation of trapped prayers, creating a vortex of spiritual energy that could not dissipate, could not end. And finally, he saw his uncle, standing where Edmund now stood, the photographic apparatus before him, saw the moment when the shutter opened, and the image was captured, not just light on sensitized glass, but something of the spirit itself, drawn into the photograph as if the camera were a kind of prison, a portable continuation of the chamber's original purpose. The photograph had not captured Ellen Bird's image. It had captured her very essence, or a part of it enough that she was split now between this place and the image itself, divided and suffering in two locations at once, and she wanted to be whole again, wanted it with a desperation that had built over years of isolation, years of being trapped in the photograph while part of her remained in the chamber. Unable to complete her torment, unable to find rest, Edmund understood. Finally, what was required of him? The photograph had to be destroyed. But not merely destroyed, it had to be released back into the chamber. The energy it contained returned to its source. Only then could the spirit be whole, and only then could it potentially find the rest it had been denied for so long. But there was a price for such a release. There was always a price. The voice that had been praying fell silent. In that sudden quiet, Edmund heard another sound, footsteps in the passage behind him. Slow, measured footsteps approaching the chamber. He tried to turn, tried to see who or what was coming, but found he still could not move. The depression beneath his feet seemed to be pulling at him now, not physically but spiritually, as if it wanted to draw him down into whatever depths it concealed. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber. Edmund could see a shadow fall across the threshold, cast by no visible body, and when the figure stepped into the light of his lantern, Edmund's heart nearly stopped. It was a man in medieval priest's vestments, the fabric faded and rotted but still recognizable. The face was pale as parchment, the eyes sunken and burning with a terrible intensity. The mouth moved, forming words in Latin, the same prayers, the same endless supplications. Thomas Bird, the mad priest of Thornfield, still keeping his vigil after 5 centuries. The ghost, for ghost it must be, did not look at Edmund. Its attention was fixed on the photograph he held. In those burning eyes, Edmund saw something beyond mere hunger. He saw madness, yes, but also a terrible kind of hope. Bird wanted release as much as his mother did, but he could not take it himself. Someone living had to complete the act, had to willingly offer up the image and accept the consequences. Edmund's hands began to move of their own accord, raising the photograph. The frame grew hot in his grip, almost burning. The image on the plate seemed to shimmer and shift. The figure within pressing against some invisible barrier, desperate to break free. No. Edmund whispered, his voice hoarse. I won't condemn myself to, but the sentence died unfinished, because he realized, with terrible clarity, that he had no choice. The moment he had entered this chamber with the photograph, the moment he had stood in this worn place in the floor, he had committed himself. The only question was whether he would cooperate or resist. And resistance would only make the process more agonizing. The ghost of Thomas Bird stepped closer. Its mouth opened wider, the prayers growing louder, more insistent. And from the photograph, Ellen Bird's spirit began to emerge, a pale, translucent form that writhed and twisted as it fought to break free from its prison of glass. And silver dot, Edmund felt his arms continuing to rise, felt the photograph growing hotter and hotter in his hands. The image on the plate began to blur, to smoke, as if it were burning from within. And then, with a sound like breaking glass amplified 1,000 times, the photograph shattered. The explosion of breaking glass was both physical and metaphysical. Shards flew outward, some cutting Edmund's hands and face, while simultaneously a wave of energy, cold and terrible, burst from the destroyed image and filled the chamber. Edmund cried out, staggering, but found he still could not step out of the depression. The pieces of the photograph scattered across the floor, some of them still showing fragments of the image, a hand here, a fold of fabric there. But the figure that had been trapped within was now free. She stood before him, or rather, she manifested, for this was not a physical presence, but a spiritual one, though no less real for that. Ellen Bird, as she had been in the final moments of her life, middle-aged, gaunt with days of enforced prayer and deprivation, her face twisted with exhaustion and suffering. Her vestments were those of a woman of the mid-14th century, simple and dark. Her arms were raised in that same position of desperate supplication that Edmund had seen so many times in the photograph. But now those arms were lowering. Now the terrible tension in her posture was easing. She looked at Edmund with eyes that held such profound weariness that he almost wept. Free, she whispered, and her voice was like wind through autumn leaves. After so long, free. The ghost of Thomas Bird had frozen at the moment of the photograph's destruction. The priest stood rigid, his face contorted with an emotion Edmund could not quite name. Was it horror? Realization? Remorse? For the first time in 5 centuries, perhaps, the mad priest was seeing his mother not as an object of correction, or a vessel for enforced penance, but as a fellow sufferer. Ellen Bird turned to face her son. The two spirits regarded each other across the small space of the chamber, and in that moment, Edmund understood the full tragedy that had unfolded here. Thomas had not merely been a cruel zealot. He had been a man driven mad by the Black Death, by the sight of his parishioners dying by the dozens, by his own inability to explain or prevent the catastrophe. He had seized on the idea that the plague was divine punishment, and that the only way to save his flock was through confession and penance. He had convinced himself that he was performing an act of mercy, even as he tortured those he was meant to protect, and when his own mother had opposed him, when she had tried to stop his cruelty, he had included her among the accused. Perhaps he had truly believed she was in league with evil forces. Perhaps he had simply been so far gone in madness that he could no longer distinguish between salvation and damnation. Either way, he had condemned her to die in this chamber, and when the villagers had locked him in here in turn, when he had been forced to endure what he had inflicted on others, the realization of what he had done had not freed him. It had only deepened his torment, bound his spirit here alongside hers in a cycle of prayer and suffering that could not end. Until now, Mother, the ghost of Thomas Bird whispered, and the word held all the anguish of 5 centuries of regret. Ellen Bird said nothing. She simply opened her arms, not in prayer this time, but in an embrace. The priest moved forward, and as the two spirits merged, there was a sudden brilliant flash of light that filled the chamber. Edmund cried out and covered his eyes. He felt a sensation of tremendous weight lifting, as if some massive burden had been removed from the very air. When he could see again, the spirits were gone. The chamber was empty save for himself, his guttering lantern, and the scattered shards of the photograph. But the depression in the floor had changed. The worn stone was cracked now, split down the middle as if by some great force, and from that crack rose a scent that Edmund recognized from his previous visit, the sweet, cloying smell of flowers long dead. He looked down and saw something in the crack, a glimpse of darkness deeper than any natural shadow. And within that darkness, movement. Something was stirring below, something that had been sealed beneath this chamber for a very long time. Edmund's paralysis broke suddenly. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping the lantern. The depression in the floor was widening, the crack spreading across the stone with small sounds like breaking bones. Whatever had been imprisoned beneath whatever the chamber had been built to contain was coming free. In horror, Edmund understood the true nature of what had just occurred. The photograph had not been the prison the chamber itself was. Ellen Bird and her son had not been trapped by chance or by the persistence of prayer. They had been deliberately bound here, their spirits used as wardens to contain something else, something far older and far more dangerous. By freeing them, Edmund had removed the seal. The crack in the floor widened further, now more than a foot across. From within came a sound, not the praying he had heard before, but something else, a sound like many voices speaking in unison, but in no language Edmund had ever heard. It was old, this voice, older than Latin, older perhaps than any human tongue. And in its cadence he heard hunger, vast and patient, and now finally satisfied. Edmund ran. He burst out of the chamber and through the passage, not caring that he dropped the lantern behind him. The flame went out instantly, plunging the space into darkness, but Edmund did not stop. He ran through the chancel, past the rood screen, down the nave. Behind him, he heard the sound of stone splitting, of earth moving, of something large rising from depths it should never have left. The south door stood open. He did not remember leaving it open, but there was no time to wonder about it now. He plunged through into the gray daylight and ran toward the light gate, toward the waiting trap and horse. As he reached the gate, he risked one glance back. The church stood as it had, gray and silent, but from the narrow window of the penitent's chamber, black smoke was beginning to seep. Not smoke from a fire, but something thicker, more substantial. It poured out like a liquid, flowing down the wall and beginning to spread across the ground. And in that spreading darkness, Edmund saw shapes, figures that were not quite human, that walked with gaits too smooth or too jerking to be natural. They spread outward from the church in all directions, and where they passed, the vegetation withered and died. Edmund leaped into the trap and urged the horse into motion. The animal needed no encouragement. It had sensed something was wrong and was already backing away, eyes rolling white with fear. The trap lurched into motion, and Edmund snapped the reins, sending the horse into a gallop. As they thundered down the road away from Thornfield, Edmund looked back one final time. The church was now almost invisible behind a spreading pall of that terrible black smoke, and from within it, he heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a sound like many voices singing in unison, a hymn of darkness and hunger and long-awaited freedom. He had thought he was releasing to tormented souls to their rest. Instead, he had opened a door that should have remained forever sealed. Edmund drove the horse mercilessly back toward Bury St. Edmunds, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had done. The spreading darkness from Thornfield Church had been clearly visible even from a distance, a black stain spreading across the Suffolk landscape like spilled ink. He had to warn someone. The authorities, the church, someone. But what would he tell them? That he had inadvertently released some ancient evil by destroying a photograph? That medieval ghosts had been serving as wardens for something even older and more terrible? He would be taken for a madman. Yet even as these thoughts raced through his mind, Edmund became aware of a more immediate problem. The horse was beginning to falter, foam flecking its mouth. He had been driving it too hard, and the poor beast could not maintain this pace much longer. He eased back on the reins slightly, allowing the animal to drop from a gallop to a canter. It was then that he saw the first sign that he had not escaped. In the road ahead, perhaps 50 yards distant, the air seemed to shimmer and darken, not like the approach of a storm, but as if the very substance of reality were thinning, becoming translucent. Through this thinning veil, Edmund could see shapes moving, the same figures he had glimpsed spreading from the church. But closer now, more distinct, they were humanoid, but only just. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid or too jerky, and as they drew nearer, Edmund realized with mounting horror that they were not separate entities at all, but rather extensions of a single consciousness, tendrils or pseudopods of some vast intelligence that had been imprisoned beneath the church for untold centuries. The horse saw them and reared, screaming. Edmund fought to control the animal, but it was beyond his skill. The trap tilted dangerously, and Edmund was thrown from his seat. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, and when he managed to raise his head, he saw the horse had bolted, the trap bouncing wildly behind it as the animal fled in blind panic. Edmund staggered to his feet, every muscle protesting. The dark figures were closer now, perhaps 30 yards away. He could see that where they touched the ground, the grass blackened and withered. Where they passed trees, the leaves fell in a sudden autumn, though it was only September. He ran, stumbling, toward a copse of oak trees that stood off the road. Perhaps among the trees he could hide, could somehow evade these things. His rational mind knew it was futile if these entities could pass through the very air like smoke. Mere vegetation would not stop them. But the animal part of his brain demanded action, demanded flight, and so he ran. As he plunged into the copse, Edmund became aware of a curious sensation. The presence of the tree's living wood, ancient roots, the accumulated growth of decades seemed to provide some measure of protection. The darkness that had been pursuing him slowed at the edge of the copse, as if reluctant to enter. The figures hesitated, their shapes becoming less distinct, more diffuse. Edmund leaned against an oak trunk, gasping for breath, and watched as the dark entities circled the copse, but did not enter. Why? What property of living wood could repel something so ancient and powerful? Then he remembered something from his medieval researches, the old beliefs about sacred groves, about the power of growing things to ward off evil. Iron and salt and running water were traditional protections, yes, but so was living wood. Rowan and oak particularly. The church had condemned such beliefs as pagan superstition, but perhaps there had been some truth to them after all. But this protection, if protection it was, could only be temporary. Already Edmund could see the darkness beginning to seep into the edges of the copse, withering the underbrush. The trees might slow the entities, but they could not stop them indefinitely. Edmund needed a plan. He needed to understand what, exactly, had been released, and whether there was any way to seal it again. The ghosts of Ellen and Thomas Bird had been the wardens, yes, but what had created that prison in the first place? There must have been someone, some power, that had bound the thing beneath the church. If Edmund could discover what that binding had been, perhaps he could recreate it. His pocketbook. Thank God he had brought it, and that it was still in his coat pocket. Edmund pulled it out with shaking hands and began to write, trying to record everything he had observed. The chamber, the depression in the floor, the crack that had opened, the nature of the entities that had emerged, all of it might be important. As he wrote, a thought occurred to him. The chamber had not been built merely as a place of penance. That had been Thomas Bird's repurposing of it, but the chamber itself was older. The church dated from the late 13th century, but the record Edmund had found mentioned certain chambers previously sealed, discovered during renovations in 1523. Those chambers had existed before the present church was built. What if the Saxon church that had preceded the current structure had been built specifically to contain something? What if the penitent's chamber was the remnant of an earlier pagan sealing ritual that the Christian builders had incorporated into their church without fully understanding its purpose? And when Thomas Bird had locked his victims in the chamber, forcing them to pray without ceasing, he had unknowingly reinforced the binding. The concentration of spiritual energy generated by endless prayer had served to strengthen the seal. But when those spirits were finally released, when Edmund had shattered the photograph and freed Ellen and Thomas to find their rest, the seal had broken. The darkness was penetrating deeper into the copse now. Edmund could see trees beginning to wither, their leaves turning black and falling in drifts. He had perhaps minutes before the protection failed entirely. There had to be something he could do, some way to reverse what he had done, or at least to contain it. But he was only a scholar, a man of books and manuscripts, not a priest or an occultist. He had no knowledge of the rituals that might seal such an evil, or did he? Edmund thought frantically back through his studies. The medieval church had dealt with cases of possession, of hauntings, of demonic manifestation. There were established procedures, prayers, exorcisms. Most scholars of his generation dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. But Edmund was no longer in a position to be dismissive. The Psalms. That was what Ellen Bird had been praying, the Miserere Psalm, over and over. It was a penitential psalm, one of the 7 traditionally used in exorcisms and purifications. And if her forced prayers had helped maintain the binding, even unknowingly, then perhaps those same prayers, willingly offered, might help restore it. But Edmund was not a priest. He had no authority to perform such rituals, no consecrated objects or holy water. He was just a man with a growing dread and a prayer book he could barely remember from his childhood. Yet what choice did he have? He could run, could try to reach Bury St. Edmunds and warn others, but these entities would spread. They would follow him, or they would spread outward from Thornfield in all directions, withering everything they touched. How far might they spread before someone found a way to stop them, if anyone could stop them at all? No, this was Edmund's responsibility. He had freed the thing beneath the church, however inadvertently. It fell to him to seal it again, or die trying. The last of the healthy trees in the copse began to blacken. The dark figures were pressing in now from all sides, no longer hesitating. Edmund could feel the cold that emanated from them, could smell the sweet corruption that accompanied their presence. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the words to the Miserere. It had been years since he had attended chapel regularly, decades since he had prayed with any sincerity. But the words came back to him, haltingly at first, then more smoothly. Miserere me Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuam, have mercy on me. O God, according to your great mercy. The darkness paused, not retreating, but pausing, as if listening. Encouraged, Edmund continued, his voice growing stronger, et secundum multitudinum miserationem tuarum, deli iniquitate meum, and according to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my iniquity. The figures began to circle him, but they did not advance. Edmund opened his eyes and saw them clearly now for the first time. They were not demons in the Christian sense, nor ghosts in the spiritualist sense. They were something older, something that predated both Christian theology and human consciousness itself. They were hunger and cold and the slow entropy of all things, the force that reduces everything to darkness and silence, and they had been bound here, in this particular place, by some ancient power that recognized them for what they were, and knew they must not be allowed to spread. Edmund continued the psalm, walking as he prayed. He did not consciously choose his direction, but found his feet carrying him back toward the road, back toward Thornfield. The dark entities parted before him, not fleeing, but withdrawing slightly, maintaining a constant distance. As he walked, Edmund felt something building within him, not power exactly, but something else. Faith, perhaps, though not in the sense he had understood it before. Not faith in dogma or institution, but faith in the fundamental rightness of pattern, in the deep structure of things. The prayers he was reciting were more than mere words. They were a form, a structure, a way of ordering reality against the chaos that the entities represented. He emerged from the copse onto the road. In the distance, he could see the church of Thornfield, still shrouded in its pall of darkness. But the darkness was not spreading as he had feared. Instead, it seemed to be responding to his prayers, drawing back toward its source. Edmund walked toward the church, still praying. The Latin phrases flowed from his lips with increasing ease, as if he were remembering not just words but something deeper, some pattern embedded in human consciousness since the first. People had looked at the darkness and decided it must have boundaries. The dark figures accompanied him, flanking him on all sides but never quite touching. They seemed almost to be herding him, guiding him back toward the church. And Edmund understood, with a clarity that was almost revelatory, that they were not entirely malevolent. They were not demons seeking to corrupt or destroy for the sake of destruction. They were simply following their nature, the same way that fire burns and water flows. They consumed light and warmth and life because that was what they were. They had been imprisoned not out of punishment but out of necessity. The way one might dam a river or contain a fire. He reached the churchyard. The gates hung open, twisted off their hinges. The graves had been disturbed, though not by physical hands. The headstones tilted at new angles. The earth itself seemed to have shifted and settled. The church door stood ajar, and from within came a sound like wind through empty chambers. Edmund climbed the steps and entered. The interior was transformed. The darkness that had poured from the penitent's chamber had filled the nave and chancel, creating a space that was no longer quite physical. The walls seemed distant and uncertain. The windows looked out onto vistas that were not the Suffolk countryside. Edmund felt as if he had stepped not just into a building, but into a pocket reality, a place that existed between worlds. At the far end of the nave, where the chancel had been, there was now an opening, not a doorway but a rift, a tear in the fabric of things. Through it, Edmund could see the chamber below, the one that had been sealed beneath the church. It was vast, far larger than the penitent's chamber above. Its walls were not stone, but something that looked almost organic, as if the earth itself had formed them. And in the center of this chamber, rising from the floor, was a shape that Edmund's mind struggled to process. It was taller than a man, perhaps twice as tall. It had the rough outline of a human figure, but the proportions were wrong, the angles impossible. It seemed to shift and change as he looked at it, as if it could not quite maintain a stable form in the physical world. And from it emanated waves of that terrible cold, that sweet corruption, that hunger that could never be satisfied. This was the source. This was what had been sealed beneath the church, what Alan and Thomas Bird had unknowingly guarded for centuries. This was what Edmund had freed. There was indeed a statue, or something like a statue, rising from the center of the chamber. But Margaret's mind struggled to make sense of its shape. It seemed to shift as she looked at it, to be simultaneously larger and smaller than it should be, to occupy more space than was physically possible. And standing before this thing, exactly as Davies had described, was a man. He wore the clothes of the Edwardian-era good suit, now somewhat dusty but otherwise perfectly preserved. His back was to Margaret, and he stood in a shallow depression in the floor, his arms raised in a gesture of prayer or supplication. He was praying. Margaret could hear it now, Latin phrases, recited in an educated voice, without pause or hesitation. The same phrases over and over, with a rhythm that suggested they had been repeated thousands of times, tens of thousands of times, perhaps millions of times over the course of years. "Mr. Fairweather?" Margaret whispered. The figure did not respond. The prayers continued, unchanging. Margaret looked around frantically for Davies. Her lantern beam swept across the chamber, and there, in the shadows at the edge, she saw him. He stood beside the wall, arms at his sides, facing the central statue. His eyes were open but unseeing, and his lips moved silently, as if he were learning the prayers that Fairweather endlessly recited. "Mr. Davies." Margaret rushed toward him, seized his arm. His skin was cold, terribly cold, and he did not respond to her touch. His lips continued to move, forming Latin words he could not possibly know. Margaret pulled at him, tried to drag him toward the passage, but he would not move. His feet seemed rooted to the spot, and as she pulled, she became aware of a presence in the chamber. Not Fairweather, not Davies, but something else, something vast and patient and aware. It knew she was there, and it was curious. Margaret felt a touch on her mind, gentle but insistent, like fingers of ice pressing against her temples. It was asking her a question, though not in words. It wanted to know if she would stay, if she would take her turn standing in the depression, adding her prayers to those of the man who had stood there for more than 20 years. The answer, the thing suggested, did not have to be now. She could go, she could flee, but she would return. They always returned, one way or another, and when she did, there would be a place waiting for her, and prayers to recite, and an eternity of cold watchfulness in this chamber beneath the church. Margaret tore herself away from Davies with a cry of terror and scrambled back to the rope. She climbed with desperate speed, her lantern swinging wildly, casting mad shadows on the walls. Behind her, she could still hear Fairweather's prayers, unchanging, eternal. She emerged into the penitent's chamber gasping and sobbing. Eleanor was there, and together the two women fled the church, not stopping until they were well clear of the churchyard. Eleanor wanted to return with help, to mount a rescue for Davies, but Margaret, though she could not explain why, knew it would be futile. Davies had been claimed by whatever dwelt in that chamber, the same way Edmund Fairweather had been claimed before him. He would stand there, praying, for years or decades or centuries, serving as a warden against something that must not be allowed to spread. She told the authorities that Davies had fallen into a crevice in the church floor, and that the space was too unstable to attempt a rescue. A nominal search was conducted, but Davies's body was never recovered. The church was declared completely unsafe, and the entire site was fenced off. Margaret Thornberry never finished her book on abandoned churches. She suffered from nervous complaints for the rest of her life and refused to discuss what she had seen in the chamber beneath Thornfield Church. Her assistant Eleanor Fletcher emigrated to Australia shortly afterward, and likewise never spoke of the incident, but Margaret kept a journal, discovered after her death in 1956. In its final entry, written shortly before she died, she made a curious observation. "I have been thinking much about Mr. Fairweather and Mr. Davies, and about the thing they guard in that terrible chamber. I have concluded that they are not prisoners, not really. Or if they are prisoners, they are also heroes of a sort. Something is sealed in that place, something old and hungry and patient. The prayers keep it bound. The watchers maintain the seal. And though they stand in cold and darkness, though they pray without ceasing until the words lose all meaning, they perform a service. They hold back the tide. They keep the rest of us safe." I think Mr. Fairweather understood this when he descended into that chamber. I think he chose it, knowing what it would cost. And when his strength finally fails, when his prayers finally cease, I suspect another will take his place. Perhaps Mr. Davies is already learning to take his turn. And one day, God forgive me, I think I shall return to that church. Not because I want to, but because I must. Because I have seen what lies beneath, and having seen it, I am connected to it. The thing in the chamber knows me now, and when the current wardens can no longer serve, it will call to me, and I will answer. I pray that I will have the courage to do what must be done when that time comes, to descend into the darkness willingly, as Mr. Fairweather did, to take my place in the depression in the floor, and add my prayers to the endless chain that binds the darkness below. Some duties cannot be refused, some burdens must be borne, and some prices, once incurred, must be paid, Today, the site of Thornfield Church is a ruin, barely visible among the trees that have grown up around it. The village itself is long abandoned, the cottages collapsed or demolished. Few people visit the area, and those who do rarely venture close to the old churchyard. But on certain nights, particularly May Day and All Hallows Eve, local people in the surrounding parishes report hearing sounds on the wind, prayers in Latin, they say, and other voices speaking in no known tongue. Some claim to see lights moving among the ruins, though there is no longer any structure that could shelter them, and occasionally, very occasionally, someone disappears while walking in that part of Suffolk. The explanations vary: lost in the woods, fallen into a sinkhole, simply wandered off and never found. The searches are usually brief and perfunctory. After all, the land there is treacherous, full of hidden dangers, but if one knew where to look, if one had the courage to descend into the chamber beneath the ruined church, one might find these missing people, standing in a line now, one behind the other, all facing the thing at the center of the chamber, praying in Latin or in English or in languages even older, maintaining the seal, keeping the watch. How many are there now? 3, 5, 10? It is hard to say. They change positions occasionally, rotating through their vigil in a pattern that makes sense only to them. But they are always there, always praying, always watchful, and the thing they guard, the tall, shifting shape that cannot quite maintain a stable form, waits with infinite patience. It has waited for centuries. It can wait for centuries more, because eventually, inevitably, the watchers will fail. Their prayers will falter. The seal will weaken. And on that day, the darkness will spread again. But not yet. Not today. For now, the prayers continue. The watch is maintained. And in the chamber beneath the ruined church at Thornfield, Edmund Fairweather stands in his appointed place, his voice hoarse but unbroken, reciting the same Latin phrases he has recited for more than 50 years. Miserere mei, Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuam, have mercy on me. O God, according to your great mercy. The words echo in the darkness, building upon themselves, layer after layer of prayer, creating a web of sound and intention that holds back the cold and the hunger and the slow entropy of all things. And so it continues, and so it shall continue, until the last watcher falls silent and the thing in the chamber is finally, terribly, free. But that is a story for another age, another generation. For now, the darkness is bound. For now, the light endures. For now, the prayers continue.